Thank you for the opportunity to present this paper at the CARE Conference 2025. Thank you to the conference organizers, and particularly Peter Easton. So this paper is ESG Assurance in the U.S., and it's recently published in the Review of Accounting Studies. If you don't know me, I'm Brandon Gipper, and this is co-authored work with Samantha Ross and Sean Shee. So the questions from the paper are two. What is the landscape and evolution of ESG assurance in the United States over the 2010 to 2020 decade? And second, what has motivated firms to obtain ESG assurance? So what are we talking about with ESG assurance? So on the slides, we have the example from Clorox from their 2020 ESG report. And so in this report, they give lots of different non-financial metrics, including, as you can see on the slide there, the greenhouse gas emissions for the year and also energy consumption for the year. And both of those have this little A next to it that are indicated at the bottom to be reviewed by Ernst & Young. And so if we go later into the report, we can actually see an assurance statement from Ernst & Young, where they provide some information to the board of directors and stakeholders of the Clorox company. And so what is Ernst & Young doing? So it's providing this statement to help the users of the ESG report essentially have some confidence in the quality of those non-financial metrics. So they do things like reference their attest standards that they're using. In this case, it's from the AICPA for review engagements. They're doing normal things that they would do like during an audit, analytical procedures, inquiring of people responsible, understanding datum systems, etc. And also they're describing their independence. So EY is also Clorox's financial statement auditor. So in order to collect the data to look at ESG reports over the 2010 to 2020 decade, we're going to limit it to S&P 500 companies, and we're going to collect a comprehensive set of ESG reports from that decade. The next thing we're going to do is, from these reports, identify 11 metrics that we're going to collect, and we limit ourselves to 6 environmental metrics, including greenhouse gases, scopes 1, 2, and 3, total waste from a company, total energy from a company, and total water. Those are the 6. And 5 social metrics, including employee gender and racial mix, safety measures for employees, and then gender and racial pay balance. And then we're going to hand collect those 11 metrics. And so we're going to see whether they're disclosed, the number disclosed, units that they might report, et cetera. And then importantly, we're going to gather assurance data, whether the level of assurance standards used assure, just like we saw with the Ernst & Young example on the prior slide. We're going to pair this data with Compustat and CRISP, and we'll ultimately have a final sample that includes 750 firms in the S&P 500 over the sample period. So let's just provide some descriptive statistics from what we get ultimately out of this data collection. So we see in Figure 1 ESG assurance on the extensive margin. That is, do companies have assurance or not? So at the beginning of the decade, it was about 38% that actually had reports with any measures at all reported. And then 6% would actually get some of those assured. Over the course of the decade, we see a substantial rise in both how many reports are issued with non-financial metrics, and then also a substantial rise in the amount of assurance in those reports, up to 35% of the entire 750 firms. So when we condition on reporting that is having any of these non-financial metrics at all, that's 46% of companies have some of their non-financial metrics assured at the end of the decade. If we look at ESG assurance on the intensive margin, we also see a substantial rise from 2010 to 2020. So starting with in reporting, about 2 metrics reported up to more than 6 metrics reported at the end of the decade. And on average, just 5% of those metrics assured, but then up to above 20% of metrics assured by the end of the decade. So almost 2 measures assured at that end of that decade. So substantial increases in the intensive margin of ESG assurance as well. We can split the type of metrics between those 6 environmental metrics and the 5 social that we collected. And so we have essentially all of that increase coming in the environmental metrics and only slight rises in the amount of assurance and reporting from social metrics. When we look at the different assure identities or types, there are 2 main categories that we think about. One are non-financial assurers. So these are like consulting firms. So the main players in this space are Bureau Veritas, ERM, Apex, Lloyd, and then a substantial mass of others. And what we see across the decade is large consolidation of market share amongst these non-financial assurers. The larger assurers are essentially eroding shares from smaller players. And then in about 2018, we also see this big shift where Apex actually acquired a part of Bureau Veritas in 2019. The other main category that we think about are financial auditors. So this is like Ernst & Young that we were talking about earlier. And so across the course of the decade, they actually have a stable market share over time. And there's almost no presence from non-Big Four. So it is EY, Deloitte, PwC, and KPMG. Whenever they do have a Big Four financial auditor as assurer, they're usually doing both of those services. Second big question we're thinking about in this paper is why are firms actually adopting ESG assurance? So we investigate three stories. The first one is kind of the economics of the reporting firms. So this is a main focus of prior research. For example, finding that larger firms tend to get assurance, usually for reasons like wanting to access ESG-focused investors, et cetera, or trying to avoid reputational concerns from the ESG reporting. But new to our paper, we're going to look also at peer effects, and then also the adoption of ESG reporting frameworks. And so on peer effects, we're going to think about a story where not obtaining assurance is likely to be perceived by investors as less transparent and more likely to be greenwashing than peers. And for adoption of ESG reporting frameworks, we think of kind of demand and supply side explanations. There's both leveraging perceptions of assurer competency to signal a commitment to credibility of ESG disclosures from the demand side, and also for reporting firms improving reporting systems, leading to them having ESG assurance readiness. On the supply side explanation, it's the case that common reporting raises scale benefits for the assurers themselves, where there's usefulness in the reporting that they can apply across clients and not having to default to customized standards from the reporting companies. So the way that we analyze this is we run panel regressions with fixed effects. So with a dependent variable of an indicator, is the company doing both reporting and assurance? And independent variables capturing each of those three stories we talked about on the prior slide, plus a set of controls and fixed effects. So the variable definitions, besides the ESG reporting and assurance variable, are for economics of firms. We use things like firm size, ROA, book to market leverage, loss and age. For peer effects, we do the percentage of firms having ESG assurance in the same two-digit SIC industry. And for ESG reporting frameworks, we look at the four most common during that decade. So an indicator for CDP, GRI, SASB, or TCFD reporting. So this is what we find. In column one, we find pretty much like prior literature that size and profitability matters for getting ESG assurance, and then some other weaker associations. In column two, we separately look at the peer effects, and we do find a strong positive association between peer obtaining assurance and the company itself obtaining assurance. And then finally, looking at the ESG reporting frameworks, we see strong positive associations between all four of those reporting frameworks and a company getting ESG assurance. In column four, we analyze these things together, and we see a substantial decline in the explanatory power of the various economic of firm type variables, except for size. But the peer effects and the ESG reporting framework effects are still strong. And then finally, in column five, we include firm fixed effects. So changes within our sample period to firms' decision to use assurance basically removes any likelihood that the economics of firms explains the outcome, but we still see peer effects and ESG reporting frameworks mattering. We can do a Shapley value decomposition in order to determine how important these various things are on a relative basis in their contribution to R squared. We find actually GRI is the most important, but the other reporting frameworks matter quite a bit as well. And then finally, we see very little impact from the characteristics of firms. So what we plan to do in next steps, so we have a working paper, and we're asking research questions such as, does getting assurance improve sustainability reporting quality? In this new working paper, we're using a research design where a self-developed carbon accounting quality variable serves as the dependent variable. And then as independent variables, we're looking at that assurance and then including controls and fixed effects. The main result we can kind of show is these two figures here, where we see that reported abnormal emissions on an absolute basis seems to go down, which indicates better reporting quality for both scope 1 and scope 2 emissions in the aftermath of first getting assurance. So to conclude, in this paper, ESG Assurance in the United States, we're asking what happened during the 2010 to 2020 decade. We find that ESG assurance has been on the rise. Sustainability assurance is itself becoming more common in particular. There's more diverse supply side than financial statement auditing with a very healthy share of these non-financial assurers. Why do firms seem to do it? Well, they're adopting reporting framework, and that's what matters the most. And then there's evidence of some complementarity between these reporting frameworks and sustainability assurance across the analyses. So, and what are we going to do next? Well, in this new working paper, we look at assurance and how it relates to reporting quality. It seems to elevate reporting quality in these Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions reporting. So thank you for your time. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to show you my research.